Hi, everybody. Welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. I'm thrilled to have Rachel Kushner here this evening. I'm Rachel Donadio. We have only Rachels on stage this evening. I'm the curator of cultural programs here at the library, and I'm thrilled to inaugurate our 2025 season with Rachel Kushner. One of the themes of our programming this year will be ways of seeing, which is writers engaging with visual art and also writers with unique perspectives. I can think of no one better to inaugurate this season than Rachel Kushner, who's written about art and who brings her own really wonderful and fabulous unique perspective, obviously, to everything she's written. She's going to be talking this evening about her latest novel, Creation Lake, about an American spy who infiltrates an eco-anarchist collective in the south of France, or southwest France. We're going to chat for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up the conversation to questions from you in the audience and to some of the people on the Zoom audience. Rachel Kushner is the author of the novels Creation Lake, The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, and Telex from Cuba, a book of short stories called The Strange Case of Rachel K, and The Hard Crowd, Essays 2000 to 2020. She has won the Prix Médicis and been a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Folio Prize, the James Tait Black Prize, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and was twice a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. She's a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and the recipient of the Harold D. Vursell Memorial Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her books have been translated into 27 languages, including French. Creation Lake comes out today in French, Le Lac de la Création. And her fiction has been published in the New Yorker and the Paris Review, and her nonfiction in Harpers and the New York Times Magazine. Welcome, please, Rachel Kushner to the American Library.
Thank you.
Okay, I thought we could kick this off. If you would like to perhaps begin reading the first few pages of Creation Lake so we can set the scene before we talk.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for that very generous introduction. So I always want to call her Donadio, and she's like, oh, we're doing last names.
Kushner.
Because we're both named Rachel. But also, I just remembered that when I was working on a novel 2 novels ago, The Flamethrowers, I was in Milan, and my Italian editor invited me to a meeting at this famous feminist bookstore called the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective. And they had like a monthly meeting in the back where all the elder female philosophers in Milan who helped create this space and this collective, and they have a press, they publish like feminist philosophy. I was way out of my depth with these people in this room, and they were all addressing each other by last name, and it was just amazing. Anyway, so I think I do it in imitation and homage of the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective.
Excellent.
Anyway, so I'll just read the very first brief chapter of this book. You guys can hear all right in the back? All right. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction, too, and especially smoking. Although it was likely, he said, that these noble and mysterious talls, as he sometimes referred to the Neanderthals, extracted nicotine from the tobacco plant by a cruder method, such as by chewing its leaves, before that critical point of inflection in the history of the world, when the first man touched the first tobacco leaf to the first fire. Reading this part of Bruno's email, scanning from man to touch to leaf to fire, I pictured a 1950s greaser in a white t-shirt and black leather jacket as he touches a lit match to the tip of his Camel cigarette and inhales. The greaser leans against a wall because that is what greasers do. They lean and loiter, and then he exhales. Bruno Lacombe told Pascal in these emails I was secretly reading that the Neanderthals had very large brains. Or at least their skulls were very large, and we can safely infer that their skulls were likely filled, Bruno said, with brains. He talked about the impressive size of Attal's brain case using modern metaphors, comparing them to motorcycle engines, which were also measured, he noted, for their displacement. Of all the human-like species who stood up on 2 feet, who roamed the earth for the last 1 million years, Bruno said that the Neanderthal's brain case was way out in front, at a whopping 1,800 cubic centimeters. I pictured a king of the road way out in front. I saw his leather vest, his big gut, legs extended, engineer's boots resting on roomy, forward-mounted foot pegs. His chopper is fitted with ape hangers that he can barely reach, and which he pretends are not making his arms tired, are not causing terrible shooting pains to his lumbar region. We know from their skulls, Bruno said, that Neanderthals had enormous faces. I pictured Joan Crawford, that scale of face, dramatic, brutal, compelling. And thereafter, in the Natural History Museum in my mind, the one I was creating as I read Bruno's emails, its dioramas populated by figures in loincloths with yellow teeth and matted hair. All these ancient people Bruno described, the men too, they all had Joan Crawford's face. They had her fair skin and her flaming red hair. A propensity for red hair, Bruno said, had been identified as a genetic trait of the tall as scientific advancements in gene mapping were made. And beyond such work, such proof, Bruno said, we might employ our natural intuition to suppose that, like typical redheads, the Neanderthals' emotions were strong and acute, spanning the heights and depths. A few more things, Bruno wrote to Pascal, that we now know about Neanderthals. They were good at math. They did not enjoy crowds. They had strong stomachs and were not especially prone to ulcers, but their diet of constant barbecue did its damage, as it would to any gut. They were extra vulnerable to tooth decay and gum disease, and they had overdeveloped jaws, wonderfully capable of chewing gristle, but inefficient for softer fare, a jaw that was overkill. Bruno described the jaw of the Neanderthal as a feature of pathos for its overdevelopment, the burden of a square jaw. He talked about sunk costs, as if the body were a capital investment, a fixed investment, the parts of the body like machines bolted to a factory floor, equipment that had been purchased and could not be resold. The Neanderthal jaw was a sunk cost. Still, the tall's heavy bones and sturdy, heat-conserving build were to be admired, Bruno said, especially compared to the breadstick limbs of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. Bruno did not say breadstick, but since I was translating, as he was writing these emails in French, I drew from the full breadth of English, a wildly superior language, and my native tongue. The Talls survived cold very well, he said, if not the eons, or so the story about them goes. A story that we must complicate, he said, if we are to know the truth about the ancient past, if we are to glimpse the truth about this world now, and how to live in it, how to occupy the present, and where to go tomorrow. My own tomorrow was thoroughly planned out. I would be meeting Pascal Balmy, leader of Le Moulin, to whom these emails from Bruno Lacombe were written, and I didn't need the Neanderthal's help on where to go. Pascal Balmy said to go to the Café de la Route on the main square in the village of Vendôme at 1 p.m., and that was where I would be. That's it.
So Kushner, this novel, the protagonist is a freelance spy who goes by the name of Sadie Smith. So she has a fake name, she has fake boobs, she's hired by an unknown, person, client. She's hired to infiltrate this eco-anarchist collective that's opposed to building of these giant mega bassins that help collect water. This book goes through so many layers of French history, from the Neanderthals to contemporary leftist collectives.
I love that you consider the Neanderthals part of French history. That's so awesome.
Well, vive la République et vive la France. There's the France starts with the Neanderthals, maybe. But I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the origins of this book. Did you start with a question that you posed that you wanted to address? Was there an image, in the way that you've sometimes talked about how one image sparked the Flamethrowers? Tell us a little bit about how this novel came about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel Donadio. Yeah, so you mentioned the narrator, who was speaking. I mean, she's reading this man, Bruno Lacombe's emails. So in a way, he's the first voice that you hear, even as she's transposing it, as you come to understand as you read. She doesn't divulge to the reader what her name is. She uses this name, Sadie, to the people that she's infiltrating. And she gives them this last name, Smith, which is actually technically my last name. I'm married to a Smith. My child is a Smith. My husband, as I understand it, has Smiths on 3 different sides of his family. And he's always thought of that name as a placeholder name. So she jokes in the book. I'm so sorry to ask, but could we hold off on the photos just till after? Is that okay? Because I start to feel self-conscious, like I don't know if I'm posing or speaking or accidentally posing.
This is the postmodern condition, Rachel.
So in any case, he's always joked that Smith is like not a real last name. And so she says in the novel that it's Anglo-American for last name. So we don't know much about her past. So I'll come back to her in a second. But in terms of like originating imagery or idea or spark for the book, I think I had started thinking about this book without overtly attempting to write it as far back as 2008. And late that year, it just so happens to have been the case that a commune in the northern Corrèze, with which I'm rather familiar personally, was raided by the French police. And watching that go down and the court case that evolved subsequent to that raid demonstrated some things to me that seemed interesting to explore on the occasion of fiction. But I wasn't really quite sure what I was going to do with it and how to shape it. I have this relationship to rural France, I would say, but in particular some regions of the central Southwest where I happen to spend a lot of time that are not too far from where I set the kind of fictional places. I call it La Guyenne, which is an Aquitaine name for a region of France that has not been used since, I guess, 1790. But it kind of gives hints of where this takes place. So I was thinking about this group of young people who are educated, bourgeois Parisians, who want to escape certain aspects of, urban life, which I think many young people, whether in 2005 or 2008 or 2013 or now, are trying to think about like different ways to live in retreat from the strictures that are meant to define like what a good life is and how to live a bad life in a good way or how to live a damaged life in a good way. So I was thinking about this group of people that decamps to a rural area and is drawn into the idea of living in a relation to a certain idea of rural resistance, which is very interesting and strong in France when you think about, like, first of all, the history of the resistance from World War II, but then prior to that, waves of peasant revolts in this part of rural France where you can kind of feel these pockets of history that sort of refuse to completely evaporate, So I was thinking, and also there are traditions of people who are of the generation of May 68 realizing that like Paris is a bust, the factory worker is not a true revolutionary subject. What about the peasant? What about the farmer? And so a lot of these people like moved to the countryside in the 1970s, whether by Maoist dictum or some other dictum, and tried to live a life that's, more holistic and in conversation with nature and growing their own food, or supporting farmers who are trying to resist various kinds of incursions from the state. So I was thinking about all of that and had the idea for this mentor who himself is a kind of refugee from the long 20th century, as I think of it and him. And I had this image of this man who is somebody who has come to believe that the messianism of waiting for revolution and talking about revolution and the time tomorrow when everything is going to change and be better is actually not coming. And capitalism has outsmarted us. It's a supple organization of life that will keep reinventing itself in order to sustain itself. And the only thing left to do, according to this character I conceived of, is to revolutionize consciousness. And his manner of doing so is to look toward the very deep past and to think, what clues have been left behind for us that we have not attended to or have not learned how to read or listen to? And then I had this image of him as a man who has moved into a cave on his own property and presses his ear to the wall of his cave and believes that he hears, like radio transmissions, the voices of people from past eras and epochs and eons. And so that was like an early image for me. And it just seemed right away like he was not really a lunatic, and this was never going to be about ridiculing somebody who believes they hear voices like radio transmissions. Like more like it would seem real, and the deeper I got into it, the realer it did seem. I mean, he's very, very loosely based is the wrong word, inspired by, in the most glancing way, a French philosopher named Jacques Camus, who is still alive, and young people I know talk about him in this way that makes him seem very mythical, and supposedly he lives in a cave. Nevertheless, several people I know seem to be in long email communication with this guy, as are the young communards at Le Moulin, the name of the communauté, where, sorry, I've been like doing French press all day long, so like in between the two. So I had this guy who's in conversation with these young people. The problem was, who was going to tell this story? And so that took me a long time to develop this character, Sadie, who is a kind of blank persona in a way, but then again, has a very strong personality. She's very blunt, even as she's not forthcoming with the reader about her own private past and her psychology, like why she is the way she is. All we know is that she's a disgraced former agent for the FBI. And I had seen personally, I mean, not exactly up close, but through friends of a friend, this case where a female FBI agent had entrapped this young eco-activist in Northern California, and he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 21 years in federal prison, served 9 of those years before his lawyer was able to successfully prove entrapment, and the judge set him free that day, and the conviction was overturned. And I had asked myself, this was in about 2004, and I had asked myself, like, what is the psychology behind that? Like, this woman was a genuine classical, if there is such a thing, a genuine agent provocateur. Like, she wasn't motivated by a political ideology. She herself was introducing the possibility of sabotage where otherwise there was none. So I kept asking myself, like, what motivates a person like that? What is that about? And then after 2008, it became clear that this British agent had infiltrated the people in Tarnac. And because I knew some of them, I could ask them, like, didn't you guys know that this guy was a narc? because so I had looked him up. His name is Mark Kennedy, for people who don't know. This is a British agent who infiltrated leftist activists in Germany, France, and England, had affairs with many of the women in these groups, who have since sued the Metropolitan UK police, and those lawsuits are ongoing. I just actually talked to the BBC about it because they have been interviewing many of the women and really getting to know them over the years, and it turns out that like every level of superior in British intelligence knew about this as it was going on. The guy had an expense account, and he himself has sued the UK police for, quote unquote, failing to protect him from falling in love. And he was found out by like some of the kids, not in Tarnack, I think it was in Germany, and they found a passport in his glove box that had his picture but a different name, and they confronted him. You know, I think there were several passports, actually. And apparently he started to cry. And he said, this is like so screwed up. I love you guys. I've been converted. I'm with you now, and I don't know what to do. I'm in this complete, existential quagmire. And because they were like nice, sympathetic people, they listened to him and they had a meeting about it. And then a week later, he disappeared. And he disappeared into the private sector of leftist surveillance and was hired by the company that was then known of as Blackwater. So, and supposedly he is a military contractor. And I had asked some of the people from Tarnack, like, after looking up photos of him and seeing that he completely transformed his image, like when he was with the German climate activist, he's a white guy with dreadlocks. And then when he aligned with the French people, who are more kind of black bloc, very clean cut, short hair, nondescript clothing, that's how he fashioned himself. I was like, didn't you guys notice that this guy he had no sense of self? He just reinvented himself. And they said, we thought he was just like coming to his senses. But so my narrator is kind of my answer to what sort of person, and because it's fiction and a parallel universe that's meant to have some of the glint of this place, she makes reference to that British spy, Mark Kennedy, as if to say, like, this is the object lesson of how you don't do things. So she only has an affair with one member of the group.
Who's the introduction to the group. This is an amazing history of the nonfiction behind the fiction. There's a great tension in this book between the cynical, believing in nothing, freelance spy Sadie Smith and the deeply probing questioning of Bruno, who's trying to think about how best shall we live on this earth and what's the best form of kind of human collective endeavor. How does that tension work for you in the novel? Was that do you see those as the two, something that drives it forward?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's so observant. Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess without being overtly conscious of it as I was writing it, the book, as in terms of like the energy of the tension circulated around those two poles of these two different people. I mean, it's like what you say after the fact when you've written a book. I always distrust it a little bit. Like, you don't want it to calcify into a mythology. But I remember being seduced by the sort of formal challenge of having two storytellers inside of one narrator. Like, that was fun for me in the very beginning, because I knew that there would be this kind of incantatory, like, he said, he told them, he said, in terms of her reporting on Bruno. At the same time, it started to become clear to me by like page 2 that an enemy camp had entered the novel, and that it was not one of us who was telling the story, meaning me and my people. It was this kind of devil, this woman who, she's not a reactionary. She claims that, inside of people there are no politics. And her reference point is mostly Ecclesiastes, which is like the bleakest part of the Old Testament. So she's a kind of amoral character. And I do not claim to bear any mark of influence by Vladimir Nabokov, but I had just reread Pale Fire before I wrote this, and so like maybe having a narrator who's like a bit of a lunatic, who's trying to parse the writings of another central character who's also possibly a bit of a lunatic, maybe was somewhat inspiring for me, but the difference between the two in valence was critical, which is why I like your question, because with Bruno, like he says early in the book in his assessment of contemporary reality, currently we are heading toward extinction in a shiny driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? And I think it's a fair question. The shiny driverless car is going faster and is more prevalent and present than I had anticipated when Bruno said that. And I think for him answering it, you know, she says, if you exit the car, what do you exit besides reality? What's outside reality besides the void? And Bruno does this kind of like folk philosophy, armchair theorizing, anthropology, magical thinking to figure out some way to be equal to the blessed gift of life on earth. And that might sound corny, but for me, I think it was, it gave me the occasion to think about things that in regular life have to be shut down and suppressed minute by minute. Like just this feeling that we have a kind of disposability casually raining down on us all the time, and we just pretend that it's fine. Like technology can get us out of the bind that technology has created for us. You know, so I have one character who's sort of facing that question in a very earnest, heartfelt way and believes in gentleness. And then she is very cynically questioning and taking distance. She's the opposite of that. But she's put into very close quarters with Bruno because she's reading his emails. So then the tension of the novel later became, what effect on her is he having?
And I think that without spoiling the novel, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this book and also about this narrator is that she is someone who speaks from a position, let's say, of experience, and ultimately she longs for a kind of innocence. Do you think that's, or at least a kind of engagement or meaningfulness, or to believe in something? And it's unclear whether that is going to be possible, but there is that, I think, desire at some point.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. I like suffering from experience rather than innocence. No, I mean she says at one point, or she has a lot of things where she'll say something and then say, I didn't say, you know, but she can turn to the reader and say it. And she says to the reader, but thinking at the people that she's interacting with, if you can follow that, you people aren't real to me. No one is. And then at another point that she is in a relationship with this guy, it's just purely instrumentalized in order to have access to the leader of this commune, you know, because they've been infiltrated already, which is me, as I explained, borrowing from reality. So there's a kind of hermetic vibe, which has been my experience with people. I mean, when you make it inside and are considered one of them, it's like you did something to get there. And she goes through those hoops in a very different way than I would, for a completely different purpose. And she's having a relationship with this guy just to be considered like a trusted insider. And he thinks he's in love with her, and the sex scenes are described in the book, and they're somewhat discomforting from what I've been told to read, because one person thinks, I'm bearing my soul to you, you know, like that's what intimacy is, like total acceptance. And she's just cold to the whole thing, but then later wondering, am I getting paid enough for this job? And so I think that there's a kind of, there is an existential crisis to that. Like Mark Kennedy, the British agent in real life, said he was in an existential quagmire when he realized that he, had gone over to the other side, but that was probably all a performance because these people were going to beat his ass, But for her, I think there is a genuine crisis to being someone for whom nothing matters. I mean, she brags at one point to the reader that she never has to clean up her trash because she will not be returning to the same place twice. And creating a character like that, I guess it actually made me more aware of what accountability is. Like, I hear people using that in a way that I worry seems a little bit like virtue signaling. But in fact, to live held by other people and to live for them, like love and art is all that matters to me. But Sadie doesn't have either one of those things. So later in the book, I think she longs for something like a spiritual identity as Bruno's daughter, even as she doesn't quite put it like that.
One of the great themes, I think, in your work is questions of community, political organization, also political violence. But The Flamethrowers is set between the art world of 1970s New York and the years of lead in Italy with the extra-parliamentary left. The Mars Room is set in a women's prison where the protagonist is serving 2 life sentences for killing her stalker. That's a form of community. Here we have Les Moulinards. I once read in an interview that you said that I am drawn to a milieu whose rules I don't understand, where there are things you can't access simply by being intelligent or doing well in school. And in every one of your books, you pull us into these worlds that we wouldn't necessarily have had access to before. Can you talk a little bit about all of that? Kushner?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Donadio. That quote, I think whether I said it in that interview where that appeared or not, I'm pretty certain that I was thinking of my first bartending job when I worked the 6 a.m. shift at a bar in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, where I'm from. The Tender Knob, actually. It was on Geary between Jones and Taylor. It was called the Blue Lamp. And I had never tended bar. I lied to get the job. I'd been a cocktail waitress with a fake ID in college. And
Sadie Smith.
So, no, actually, it was just my mother's last name, Droston. So my ID said Rachel Droston. I don't know. I sometimes wonder if I'd just taken that name. But anyway, because I'm Jared Kushner's daughter from a different marriage, I kept his name. But so I had never tended bar, and my first shift was a morning shift, and there were people waiting outside because they stopped serving liquor in San Francisco at 2 a.m. I guess all of California maybe, and these people are just they're just waiting to get in at 6, and they were pretty patient with me, not knowing how to make their drinks. Like, honey, you got to grab it by the neck and turn it upside down and count to 3. So I think it's that. It's being plunged into a world that is full of information that has to be learned through firsthand experience. And maybe I've always been drawn to that feeling of having to tease out information, And like when I was writing The Flamethrowers, I had met some people who had been involved in leftist politics in Italy in the 1970s through personal connections, through my husband. He's really good for that, turns out. Because my relationship to the people in France, it's the same thing. It's through him. But then I became curious. Like, there had not been a novel written about the movement of 1977. Some people call it the years of lead. I'm more interested in like the autonomous streams of thing, but the Red Brigades is a real phenomenon. It sort of has to be thought about and dealt with. And there are many other like small sub-lines of things that were going on, and also a very open student movement. So there was like an armed movement and then a student movement. And somebody was taking me through San Lorenzo, which is a sort of critical neighborhood in Rome where a lot of the history of this movement is still quite present. There's still a free radio station there, et cetera. And I was asking this person who knows a lot about this era, so, like, who was in the open student movement, and who was, like, of the people you're talking about, were they in the armed movement or the student movement? And there was no answer. And I just realized right then, like, silence also is information. And certain things just really cannot be said. They have to be delicately apprehended. And then the fun job is to reproduce that in fiction, which isn't really about vagueness and more about subtlety, and also just knowing that you can't really always understand the complexity of things, which is maybe why I tend to choose a narrator who's a little bit of an outsider. It's more interesting to me to know that there's a pulse of complexity of information than to be the one to reassure the reader that it's just as crude as you suspected. The good guys are over here and the other people are over there. It's seldom to never like that.
I want to shift slightly, but on the same track, to this terrific essay that you have in the December issue of Harpers, in which you travel around the United States with your son, going to hot rodding conventions, which is also a kind of community, and it's also a kind of learning from experience. Your son is a complete, naturally taught mechanic, and you also have always been a great lover of cars, motorcycles. The first essay in the Hard Crowd about your experience riding a motorcycle in your 20s. I mean, you have a very high tolerance for physical danger. But can you talk a little bit about that essay and about that hot rodding experience and that whole, you're the narrator of that?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that. My first essay in the Hard Crowd is called Girl on a Motorcycle, and it's about illegal road race that spans the entire length of the Baja Peninsula, 1,100 miles, that I did in my early 20s, a long time ago. And I gave up riding motorcycles, which my father still has not done at 86. I tried to ride his bike recently, and he put a sidecar on it, and it like veered violently to the right, and I almost crashed into a parked car on this like priceless collectible Vincent Black Shadow. That's neither here nor there. But I have always loved classic cars. My dad is into cars and motorcycles. He always worked on them. I've always been around people who, to symbolize things. I've always been around people who love the smell of gasoline. I don't myself love the smell of gasoline, but I had occasion to think deeply about how and why people love that smell. It's about positive associations to some degree. I remember as a teenager asking my friend Armand, who is a professional off-road racer. He races what I call dune buggies. Asking him as a teenager, like, why do you love the smell of gas? And he said, because it smells like fun. It smells like getting up early and doing things. And my son is that way too. He loves to get up early and do things. I have a classic car, but I've often just taken it to a mechanic. My son at 15 got a classic car, a 1969 Dodge Dart, which barely ran. He had to completely rebuild it to even get it roadworthy. And by the time he was 16, he'd already rewired it and rebuilt the front end and converted the brakes from drum to disc. And if anybody wants to talk about that afterward, we can. But we started going together to nostalgia drag races where people race vintage drag racing vehicles from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And at the highest levels of drag racing, the fastest cars are the funny cars and top fuel, and they put nitromethane in them, which is basically dry cleaning solvent, which somebody at some point long ago decided, let's put this in an internal combustion motor and see what happens. And the level of danger that results from that is quite incredible. Like, if you don't have spark to one of the 8 cylinders of your internal combustion engine, let's just say you're like not yet driving an electric car, the most that will happen is that your car just won't run on all 8 cylinders. If you don't have spark to all 8 cylinders and you're running nitromethane, the motor will explode. So there's incredible risk there. And the people who build and race these vehicles, they're rebuilding the motor basically after every single pass down the drag strip. And there's a kind of folk knowledge that people practice and share that was a dizzying expertise to me. So I had my son with me, and he could explain, because he's into chemistry, the properties of nitromethane, of all these different fuels, how they work, why they have to rebuild the clutch because the plates in it get so hot that they fuse together during the run, et cetera, et cetera. And we spent 9 months going to events, and I read an 800-page book on the history of nitromethane. I know I don't sound very knowledgeable now, but I'm jet-lagged. And it was just, I guess we were really taken with the subculture of this world, which seemed to prove that people are not through with active activities. The children at these events have tools in their hands. They are not scrolling on their iPhones. And like the pits are open, it's open pits. There were families. There are a lot of women drivers. There were women crew chiefs, women car owners. And it's also possibly racially the most diverse sport in America. And that part of it I hadn't quite anticipated, but I kept having occasion to promote drag racing in a way I wouldn't have known I'd be promoting it beforehand.
It's a really fascinating and beautiful essay, and one of the things that also struck me about it is your son hangs out with these older people in the subculture of drag racing to understand how to do it. And you said, like, why don't your friends your age do this? And he says they don't really have any hobbies. And you ask him why, and he says because of the internet.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, but his interests also veer toward, middle-aged men. And also, I think he prefers to hang out with people who have things like an engine hoist, which tends to be middle-aged men.
Do you have a sense from your traveling around of America and looking through this subculture? I mean, do you have any large thoughts on the state of the fissures and fractures in America and also the forms of community?
I do. I mean, it might sound a bit romantic, but part of doing this secretly, I mean, many things were motivating it. Among them, just a kind of pure, uncut joy in the experience, and also being with my kid, whose company I revere and love, and I learned so much from him and from other people. But underneath it all, I knew that Trump was going to be the president. It seemed like the writing was on the wall to me, and I wanted to stay close to people. And I had this profound sense that national politics is very abstract to a lot of people. And the strange thing about the voting booth for that sector of the population that does actually vote is no one is watching you in there. And so, people are making weird decisions in that space that may not directly inhere on their ability to accept otherness, their ability to love strangers, to help a person in need. And you go to the drag strip, and if you are hungry, somebody will feed you. If you are thirsty, there is a drink for you. If you need shade, there's shade. There was this sense of community and common cause that was very beautiful to me. And I say in the essay that I would describe the environment as, if not religious, congregational. And I think that that's an element. It's funny you talk so much about America, but since you asked, and that essay was very much about America, I think that element of community is so missing for a lot of people when you look at how atomized culture is. But this was one space where people know each other, they help each other out, and also they're just completely open to anybody who wants to learn. And so in terms of specifically answering the question, I want to think that for most people, even if I would say 90% of the people that are involved in nostalgia drag racing probably, if they didn't vote for Trump, would have, theoretically. A lot of people are hypothetical voters, but that is not the most present experience of their lives, is how they identify in terms of their politics. But then, and sorry, this is so pundity, but there was an article in the New York Times in the fall that looked at relative wage declines from, I think it was 1980 to 2022. And that was very illuminating when you look at uneducated, more modestly educated, non-college educated white men. I mean, especially in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. And you see how their relative wages have plummeted. It doesn't at all excuse resentments that harden into ugliness and fear of other people or xenophobia. But it does maybe explain how it is that the groundwork for such an emotion starts to form. And I felt like, just personally for me, having information is helpful.
Yeah. As a student of political violence, what do you make of Luigi Mangione?
Oh, man.
You don't have to answer that if you don't want to.
No, I've had different thoughts about that. They're still forming. I mean, at first, I thought it was totally incredible. It was kind of wild moment, I mean, somebody had picked up the pistol from the mantle. And I was doing an event in San Francisco, and my aunt came, and she's been a nurse at Kaiser for her entire professional life. And she said he did a good thing. And her daughter, who works in the health insurance industry, was like, "What did you just say?" She said, "I said he did a good thing." And you just have to think about why people who've been burned by the healthcare industry or have seen their patients burned by the healthcare industry are responding the way they do, or the way that they have. In terms of what it symbolizes, I don't think that it's a viable path to a better world. There is something fascinating to me about him being the product of this kind of privilege where he went to the best schools. He was a brilliant student, went to Penn, studied engineering. And so he had all of these ingredients where you're supposed to benefit from and work the system. And he looked in the other direction and said, this is all wrong. But then what he did with it, who knows? I mean, maybe he's having some incipient mental illness. It's not clear. But I thought one interesting thing about him was the book review that he left on Goodreads for Ted Kaczynski's manifesto.
Which features in the Mars Room.
Right. I mean, yeah, his diaries are in the Mars Room because a friend of mine owns those diaries, which were written in numerical code. And if they weren't going to be in the book, they wouldn't be anywhere. And I was struck by his tone. I couldn't emulate it, so I just put them in the diaries. I was thinking the way Sebald puts in the postcards, and then the narrative just has to kind of flow around them like they're the rocks in the stream. And I sort of just had to deal with Ted's diaries. I find him to be a real crank and a misanthrope who may have been right in anticipating the technological destruction of the world, but for the wrong reasons, because it was just inconvenient for him. He doesn't like people. He didn't care about humanity. Ted Kaczynski, his neighbors were making noise with their snowmobiles, so he just went over there and, poured gasoline on the snowmobiles and burned them to the ground. And they were getting drunk and partying, so he just emptied their bottles of vodka. Like, he hated other people. And Luigi has a review of Ted Kaczynski's manifesto and says, like, this guy wanted to hurt people and deserves to be in prison. But he was right in his analysis of what's wrong with our society.
This also loops back to Creation Lake. Kushner, we could talk all night. I would like to open it up to questions from the audience for about 10 minutes because we started a little bit late. So I wonder if Mayanne, if you raise your hand, we'll pass around a mic and someone will come to you, but please wait for the mic to ask your question. But first of all, Rachel, thank you. This is great.
Thank you, Rachel.
Be brave.
I'll be brave. I have to say, it's such a pleasure to be in this space and to hear you speak about your work. It's really exciting. Creation Lake is a great read waiting at the prefecture for a visa. I read about 200 pages during my wait. And I remember being very struck by this sort of genius and very funny reoccurring image of the lay babies stickers in the house, and how at first they're in this room that Sadie avoids, and then eventually she finds herself surrounded by the lay babies stickers. And I just wanted to ask about the imagery of the lay babies and how that came into the book for you, and how that sort of situated in the narrative.
Thank you for asking about that. You are the first person who ever has. So that's wonderful. Yeah. There were these dolls in France in the 80s called Les Babies. And I learned about them while viewing an exhibition by an American artist who's a good friend of mine, Laura Owens. She had this show at the Vincent van Gogh Foundation in Arles. Which, all the shows there are sort of like in conversation. You saw that show?
I saw it, so it was a beautiful show.
Yeah, incredible show. And at the time I was at a residency in Minerve at the Dora Maar house. And I went to go see that show. And upstairs she had all these books. Laura hand makes these books in a lot of her shows. I mean, these days more. And she had done a book about Les Babies. And I'd never heard of this. And just the idea of the French definite article with the American word babies was this a wonderful conception. And I didn't exactly remember what the babies look like. She had taken an image of one of them and then replicated it through this book that she'd made about Les Babies. But then, this is just what happens when you're writing. Like, it came up and I thought, Sadie's staying at the ancestral country home of this fake boyfriend, Lucien. And sometimes you go to these rich people's house and there's one tennis shoe in a closet. There's some airport waterlogged fiction. The richer they are, the more sort of casually disorganized the house is, because it doesn't have the class anxiety ring camera that's turned inward the way that middle class people have, where they're like, we're living right. So I thought there's going to be these stickers around. And then the more I wrote, the more Les Babies came to seem specific in a way that maybe they weren't in the real version that I was inspired by, because they're aping the trappings of adult life. Like, it's a baby driving a mail truck, a baby who's a butcher, a baby who's a delivery man. And so then Sadie could have a kind of commentary on what this is, and then it just came back like a trope later in the book. Like Bruno says that when you meditate underground, living in a cave, images from the commercial material world may come back to you, like what people say about the challenges of meditation, like you just sort of let the thought float past. And I thought Bruno would say, even if it's like a brand of cookies from his childhood that's right there again, you sort of acknowledge it, say hello, and wait for it to float away, and that she would have this experience of Les Babies.
Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question about the spy aspect of your book. When I recommend it to people and they say, well, what's the book about? And I say, well, it's a spy novel, I very quickly have to add, but it's not really like any spy novel you've ever read before. And I love spy novels. And what strikes me is the way you transpose a lot of the old tropes about male spies into a new kind of feminist form. And I guess my question is whether you're a fan of, old-fashioned spy fiction and whether that kind of work had an influence on what you wrote.
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I mean, if you tell people it's a spy novel, you should immediately radically lower their expectations. As I aim to generally lower people's expectations and radically.
Spy novel. There might be air quotes.
But I was inspired to a degree by a particular spy novelist, Jean-Patrick Manchette, French writer from the 70s. And I came to him probably, way later than French people, certainly, especially French men of a particular age. If you mention Manchette, they're like, oh, it's a love language. And I read all those novels in English, like in one summer. I mean, they're really short, and I think there's 10 of them that he wrote mostly in the 1970s and then seemed to have kind of stopped writing. I think he was sick and then died in maybe 1995. But Manchette, like many of the other writers of his generation, was totally steeped in American crime fiction. It seems to be kind of the basis of French crime fiction. And so I came to American crime fiction sort of in this backwards way through Manchette. And Manchette considered himself to be a kind of like subversive crime novelist. Like he was, a fanboy of Guy Debord and decided that, he's going to get around the problem of the market recuperation of the novel form by recuperating it in himself as degraded genre fiction. And he was saying, like, next I'm only going to write pornography, like to go lower and lower. But the novels are so funny, his novels, and so bursting with life. And they kind of take the problem of commercial life in France after '68, where everyone's just taking advantage of, affordable cars and movies on the weekends, and living this bourgeois life. Like, he makes that the sort of detective's playground. And maybe it gave me this permission that was foreign and new to me, which was to have narrators do things, like have them be really active. And so I'm distracted by that sound.
Yeah.
Is it coming from? Is the call from inside the house, or is it out there?
I think it's an adjacent building. It's nothing to worry about.
Okay, I'm going to pretend it's not happening.
Any other questions?
But yeah, thanks for asking about that. But now I've become more into crime. There are certain American crime writers who are very popular in France, or were, that have almost no readership in the United States. Like, as my French friends love to say, Horace McCoy. Do you guys know who that is? He wrote They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which was made into a movie starring Jane Fonda. And also this really slim book called I Should Have Stayed Home. And it's like really, really bleak work. And he's so famous in France, right? So I've come to it after. But I feel like I just more borrowed elements of the genre to feel the pleasure of making things happen in a book. And also I wanted to feature a French minister who maybe comes to a bad ending. But unlike Manchette, I don't have the chops to knock off a prime minister yet. So I heavily demoted my minister to deputy sub-minister of the Ministry of Rural Coherence.
which is a great name for a ministry. But yeah, and it exists. Other questions? Surely there must be other questions. Yes, we'll have the mic come to you.
I'll try to keep my questions short. Just to that point you were making about having two storytellers in one voice, or perhaps the other way around, how did you manage that as you were working through it? Like, what sort of guidelines or rules did you have to set in place, or what did you have to first figure out along the way as you were making that happen? Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I mean, this is a little specific, but there's a movie by Chris Marker called Sans Soleil. Does anybody know that film? And it's an essay film where you see imagery and then you hear a voiceover, and they aren't directly connected. And the voiceover, there's two versions of this film. The version that is in English, the voice is of a woman who I think is French-American, but she has French-English. She has an English accent, and she's talking about letters that she's received from a man. So she speaks in the first person, but she says things like, the first image he told me of was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965. That's the first line of the film. And then you see this imagery of children in Iceland from the 70s. It's like Super 8 footage, or maybe 16, I'm not sure. But it's, he told me. And then she says, he wrote to me of this. He said to me this. He said this. And I've always loved the mystery of that. It seemed like really magisterial. That character is kind of a stand-in for the filmmaker, Chris Marker. And I borrowed it right away, the first line of my novel, you know. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. And I thought, oh, I'm going to just borrow this device from Sans Soleil. I didn't yet know that Sadie would be this kind of brutish figure. The voice in the movie is much more elegant and alluring. But it was this incantatory, like, he told them, he said, that gave me the permission and the challenge to see if I could keep that going. So then later in the book, when Bruno talks about his childhood, I thought, let's see how long I can go just with Bruno speaking and have the reader kind of forget that it's all being interpreted by her all the time, and then be able to come back to her. So she's the present action, and there are chapters that are just present action her, and then there are chapters where she's reporting on what Bruno is saying. And the trick for me also was that I didn't want the Bruno chapters to feel like they were in spiritual italics. Like when I'm reading a novel that has a backstory and a front story, I kind of just want to skip through the backstory, you know, or if it's letters, I want to skip through the letters. And so I really didn't want it to feel that way. Part of resolving that was making the chapters very short, and also giving them a kind of, trying to end each one in an abrupt manner that would sort of like push the reader into the next chapter. Thank you.
We can take maybe one more question. Ma'am, the mic is on its way. Madame.
I hope I can say this correctly, but Kushner with jet lag is fascinating and interesting, and I'm just mesmerized. I just wonder what you're like without jet lag. I was told it was a spy novel, and so when I read the first chapter, I was going, what? What's going on? And it took me a while to get into the book. But listening to you read it tonight, it was so funny, and now I'm going to get the book again and read it. I think a second read would be wonderful. But I listened to it, actually, when I couldn't get into the reading. I listened to it, and you read it, if I remember. Yeah, and I'm wondering how you chose to do that, because it takes a while. It takes time.
Well, I have now read 4 of my audiobooks, so I've kind of learned how to do it. I mean, having the author read the audiobook is not to everyone's taste, but and thank you for saying that. That's very nice. Some people want like a really, really theatrical reading of the book with different voices. And somebody else had read my first two novels, and I didn't listen to either one, but with the Flamethrowers, it's a first-person novel spoken in the voice of a young woman. And I decided after that if I had the opportunity, I would like to read my own audiobooks. So for my next novel, The Mars Room, I asked, and they made me audition. So I auditioned, and like a month later, they got back to me and they said, you can do it. And so I practiced a lot. When I was doing the final revisions of the proofs, I was either reading out loud or hearing in thought what the out loud version of the sentence would sound like. And then by the time I recorded the audiobook, I felt like this. I felt like a hamster running a maze that hamster built itself. And so I knew every like twist and turn, and it was incredibly satisfying for me. And I decided from there out that maybe there was some use to it, because then you really have to own the grammatical structure of all your sentences. Like nothing can be, which isn't just, no book is going to be perfect, but for me, it's become part of the process of writing the book, is that I know I'm going to have to speak it out loud, which is partly why Sadie brags about having a terrible French accent. It was damage control for when I was going to do the audiobook.